So this new direction in my work was inspired by two observations. The first is that for my dissertation and first book, Make Mafuza, The Making of a Collar Intellectual, I had focused on the emergence of a literate class of Zulu speakers, and that therefore I had largely focused on the Zulu elite to the exclusion of non-elite groups. The second observation is that although the word elite seems to have defined itself in the study of colonial Africa and colonized Africans, it is by no means clear that the word non-elite has a meaning, or the opposite of elite, non-elite, has a meaning. There are several alternative terms that I could have chosen to use instead of non-elite. For example, the word subaltern suggests itself immediately, especially since it has been so eloquently and thoroughly theorized. The other word coming from a different literature is lumpen proletariat, since what concerns me are the lives of those Zulus who were not working, or at least who were not incorporated into the labor force, but were somehow living on the margins of the booms and busts of the mineral economy that emerged in South Africa in the late 19th century. The Zulu policeman emerged from these two considerations. He represents non-elitism precisely because his profession was not respectable and didn't require training in the way that being a clerk or a journalist or a teacher, etc., required. Also, and this is paradoxical, the Zulu policeman is present at the birth of South Africa's mineral revolution, but his policing functions are, and then now I like my computer, his policing functions are an extension of an already existing colonial preoccupation with law and order. So this proposed project is an attempt to define what meant to be a member of the Zulu non-elite in 19th century South Africa, but also how the function of the native policeman was defined through the use of clothing and accoutrement, if you want to use the French term. The first thing to know about the Zulu, or the Zulu native policeman, sometimes I use the three terms, Zulu native policeman, sometimes I use Zulu policeman, sometimes I use native policeman. But these are all terms largely invented by photographers. So this is the first important thing, is that his designation exists almost entirely in the photographic archive. This is why an integral part of this project is about reading and interpreting photographs. The second thing to know about the Zulu native policeman is that he is preceded in history by a rabble of levies and mercenaries and other regiments. This latter history is most emblematically represented in a painting by Thomas Baines, which I'm going to show you in a moment, South Africa's father of landscape painting. Baines was born in 1820 in Norfolk, England. In 1842, he traveled steerage, which means you sort of travel at the bottom of the ship, the cheapest tickets. He traveled steerage to Cape Town, where he began to practice his art commercially. In 1848, he joined an ox track north to the Orange River and gained his first experience of travel into the interior, sketching and painting. In 1851, he was enlisted as an artist with the British Army in the, as they used to call them, CAFR War, the Cape Frontier War of 1850 to 1853, before returning to England. The painting, and this is where then I'm going to connect to my slide. I think I've got it. It takes a bit of time. This is the painting that is in some ways, I would call it the father of all policemen, images. And so when Thomas Baines painted that, he was representing a whole army of people, because as you can see, sort of at the knees of the name of the painting is the Loyal Fingal. And at the knees of the Loyal Fingal are two or three or several other people sort of walking in formation. And what is intriguing and exciting and exhilarating about this painting is that it doesn't really represent somebody in a military uniform, which is the sort of starting point of my kind of theoretical framework. Because as you can see, the man there is wearing a kind of cobbled together outfit. One could say he's sort of wearing khaki. in terms of the material, but khaki wasn't invented at this time. There's actually a very specific moment. Again, South Africa had everything to do with it, the invention of khaki. And one of the best commentators on that, you may not believe this, is Mark Twain. Mark Twain was around when khaki was invented. So one of the first comments about the fact that South Africans had come up with this dusty brown fabric was Mark Twain. So it's not khaki because it wasn't invented at the time. But he's wearing a hat with feathers in it, which is not a military thing. But if you notice, under his hat, he's wearing what Americans call a do-rag, which is basically a cloth that people of color often, or any kind of head wrap that people of color often have to wear. And you see this a lot as well with Ethiopian kings, a certain period of Ethiopian kings, where they would wear do-rag under the hat because you're actually protecting the hat from the oil, the Makassa oil, as people used to like to call it, the Makassa oil that Africans often have to put in their hair to make it soft. So you're protecting the hat from the oil in your hair. So you wear scarf underneath, and this is why the African Americans call it a do-rag. It's to protect your do, but it's also to protect your hat. And you can see an earring there somewhere. He's got a rifle slung over his shoulder. Again, an image that's often not seen of black men in colonial South Africa carrying guns. And that's a kind of side issue of part of my project, but it is part of the project. And he is also wearing around his waist what looks like a genitaal and then a horn, probably a snuff, that he's got his snuff in there. And I call this a kind of spectacular dandyism, precisely because it doesn't really belong within our understanding of what a military uniform looks like. It does not have the formality of a military uniform. And as you will see, this was kind of quite common in images of the Zulu policeman. But what is the justification for doing this kind of work? So at one level, it's about clothing, and this is basically the central element of the project. And there's been various kind of theoretical excursions, let's say, into clothing and fashion. But largely, people have been looking at fashion and clothing as themselves not implicated in the fashionability that they're writing about. So one of the things that you realize when you read somebody like Roland Barthes, who has written a lot about fashion, he has a whole book called The Language of Fashion, The Fashion System, etc., etc., is he's really writing about fashion almost to ridicule the fashion industry, to sort of say, you know, they spend so much time talking about these clothes, but actually what they're constructing are not, they're not really talking about the clothes, they're talking about the aesthetics, they're talking about this, but he's talking as an outsider. But what is interesting is that even from that outsider's position, he manages to come up with insights about why it is that clothing is actually a separate item that has to be studied separately from other forms of subjecthood in some ways. So in this case, the quote that I've selected from him is this quote about the way that even the way that we interpret clothing is class-based in itself. So he says, outside of the leisured classes, dress is never linked to the work experienced by the wearer. The whole problem of how clothes are functionalized is ignored. And so he's pointing out to exactly the fact that we tend to assume that it's only the elites who wear clothes that are sort of appropriate to the occasion. This is but somehow working people or poor people don't know how to do that. They don't functionalize their clothing. They sort of just get dressed. And so this is what my project is partly stimulated by. And then the second theoretical position is a slightly comical one as well, because some of you may know the existence of this book, but it's one of the best books about clothing, if you like clothing, by Thomas Carlyle, who was actually writing this as a joke. He was making a joke on philosophers, especially the kind of continental philosophy, the systems philosophy. He was making fun of that because the entire book is basically about a philosopher who's trying to write about clothing. And he comes up again inadvertently with some very amazing insights on clothing. And the book is called Sator Resatus, which means the tailor retailored. And again, you can just hear from the title that he was kind of making a joke. But he then has these very kind of interesting, again, observations. So one of the observations he makes is the link between policing and society. He says, how much has been concealed? how much has been defended in aprons? Nay, rightly considered, what is your whole military and police establishment? Charged at uncalculated millions, but a huge scarlet-colored, iron-fastened apron, wherein society works uneasily enough, guarding itself from soil and steely sparks in this devil's smithy of a world. Now, that image is basically the idea that the policeman is a kind of apron that protects society when society is sort of working and creating itself in this kind of smith's shop, that the policeman is a kind of barrier that basically protects society from the sparks and the dirt and the soil of actually creating society. And I think, again, this is a kind of insight that you would spend months sometimes trying to put that in your own words, and then you read Thomas Carlyle, you think, why am I bothering? I should just quote Thomas Carlyle on policing. So this is the first image of the policeman that I'd like to discuss. This image has created a lot of problems for me, and in a couple of months, hopefully there will be a little article that's going to come out in a book about the Nob Theory. And again, you may be surprised to realize that despite the fact that the Nob Theory has been with us for generations as part of the images that come out of South Africa, ethnographic, anthropological, policing, there's actually not that much literature on Nob theories, and this is what causes the problem. Much of the literature on Nob theories is of the Nob theory as an artifact. So it's literature that comes out of art history, museum history, gallery, catalogs, etc., etc. There's no literature on what it's actually used for. So then when you have to write an article about the Nob theory and have to tell people, okay, this is what it's used for, people go crazy. They go, no, that's not what it's used for. It's a walking stick. And you're like, no, it's not a walking stick. So I had a whole kind of conversation with the editors of this collection in which a reviewer basically laid into me for really things that he or she herself was guessing about, not things that were factual, but that they were guessing about. So, for example, one of the complications with this photograph, okay, just to give you the basic kind of stuff that I do, it comes from an archive. The Caney brothers are very famous in Natal. They basically had a studio, and a lot of their photographs, you may have seen a lot of their photographs, they took family album type photographs, loads of portraits of colonial South Africa were done by the Caney brothers. So they're very famous in the history of photography in South Africa. And as you can see, the photograph is a studio photograph. So this is one of the first things that is often difficult to explain to people who are looking at these images for the first time and sort of reacting to them as ethnographic photographs, because many of them were really created for reasons other than ethnography. But in this case, there's some interesting ethnographic elements. The first one is obviously the hierarchy, which you can see in this case. And again, it's a peculiarly colonial hierarchy in which the white policeman is sitting down and the black policeman is sort of almost attending to him in a very kind of royal, noble kind of way. And the policeman is holding a knobkiri, and he's literally almost holding just by his fingers the spear. The black policeman is barefoot, again, something that I will have to spend a lot of, and then people also often argue with me about it. Everyone has their theories about why these policemen are mostly barefoot. So he's barefoot. The white officer is obviously wearing shoes, as you can tell. And as you can tell, the white officer is not really wearing a uniform. The only thing that kind of associates him with colonialism is the pith helmet, which I'm now told is quite fashionable. The pith helmet. And then the thing that causes the most controversy when I say it is the fact that he's holding a little stick in his hand, which looks like a miniature version of a knobkiri. And this is where all hell breaks loose, because everyone suddenly says, no, it's not a miniature version. Now, in military terms, what he's holding, and this was very useful because I actually found this photograph on a website dedicated, and this is something else I'll talk to you about later, that there are all these websites that are basically amateur historians who are recovering South Africa's military history and basically creating their own websites. And this was from one of those websites. And the person who is the curator of this website had put this very beautiful description describing what the photograph is, that it's a cabinet photograph by the photographer William Laws Caney, showing an armed member of the Nongai. And this is something else that, because the word Night Watchman, I'm only using it as an English equivalent of the word Nongai, which is the Zulu or the Nguni word for a night watchman. And as I will talk to you later, it's also the name of a journal or a magazine which white policemen established for themselves in 1907. And I'll talk about that in a moment and how it affects my project. So now, in the description, that little stick that the white officer is holding is described as a swagger stick. Now, this is, again, where the whole thing falls apart, where people start just trying to tell me what a swagger stick is. Now, in basic terms, a swagger stick is the military equivalent of a stethoscope. You use it to point to things, to diagnose problems. So a senior officer uses the swagger stick to point to the mistakes of junior officers. So if the senior officer doesn't like the way that you're wearing your uniform, they will tap you using that stick. So they will say, "Soldier, why is your collar not right? Why?" So they use it almost the way that a doctor uses a stethoscope, as a way to avoid physically touching you, but while pointing out all your mistakes. But also they use it as a parading stick. You put it under your arm and you walk with it. So in a parade, if you're a senior officer. And there are various kinds of swagger sticks. There's no one kind. Some of them have got ivory knobs. They've got insignia on them. There are various kinds. But then the question is, well, why does this guy have one with a knob on it? And so everyone then starts to offer their different opinions. But in my analysis, it's a miniature version of the Nob Theory. And so in the way even that he's holding it, because this is somebody else, the reviewer tried to suggest to me that it was a walking stick. And I look at it, I had to point out the obvious. Exactly, that the length of that stick that the white officer is holding is only about torso length. You would not lean on that, and it's so thin that you would not lean on it. It would just break. But anyway, this is why I say all hell breaks, because people just start to use common sense. Okay, so this was the Zulu policeman who started it all. His name is Sergeant X. And this is the other aspect of the project, is that many of these men were anonymous and are anonymous. They were never given names. Nobody ever pointed to their names. They were, so, as I say, in this case, he was just called Sergeant X. And he's from the Cape Town, the National Library in Cape Town. And just to show you how there is still this circulation of these images, I found this photograph maybe in 2011 when I started doing bits of research on the project. And it took me about probably 4 years to find exactly the same image on the internet, but with modifications. So on the internet, suddenly there's like a filling in of his calves and ankles. So somebody used like a silver pen to fill in or reshape his. It's like a very bizarre image, but it suddenly appeared on the internet. So Sergeant X, again, is in a studio. And we can talk about this later, but there's a whole set of questions about how did these men end up in photographer studios? Were they asked to pose? Did they go there because they wanted the images? Because this is the whole subject, the subject position of the policeman. Did they want these images? Were these images like the sort of, I don't know if most of you know about Dagen Cronin, but Dagen Cronin is South Africa's premier ethnographic photographer who went around South Africa in the 1930s photographing people. But most of Dagen Cronin's photographs of supposed ethnic groups are posed. He used to curate what people are wearing. So he used to say, I think what you need is a leopard skin. And then he would take out a leopard skin from his toolbox and put it on somebody and say, now you look like the image of blah, blah, blah. So he used to curate and put together the outfits that people used to use, which makes the archive complicated. So people often ask the same thing about these photographs. Did the photographers basically give these policemen props to wear, to etc.? Because in this case, as you can see, he's wearing a necklace. And this is a complicated, because again, like the Loyal Fingal that we started off with, it's not part of a policeman's uniform to wear a necklace. But you can see that he's a senior officer because he's got chevrons on his sleeves. So he's got some kind of status. But you can also see that his uniform is a bit, or is threadbare because there's a patch right on his sort of right thigh. And here again, he is in a kind of posture of sort of a relaxed physical stance, so he's not hostile. So when you see a lot of ethnographic photographs, people are staring into the camera because that's what they were told to do. Because again, here, there's a whole set of explanations about why it is that Africans often are shot by the camera, sort of staring into it. One of the explanations is the fact that it used to take a long time for a photograph to develop. So you just had to sit still. So people eventually, and you'll see a lot of ethnographic photographs as well, where photographers used to put a prod in someone's back so that they stayed in the same position. So when you look at the photograph, you can see that there's something coming out of the person's back and going all the way down to their feet, so that they stand up straight and they don't move around, especially with children as well. Photographers used to put those prods in. It's like, almost like those stands, you know, in school when you used to experiment with test tubes. You used to have that stand that's exactly like that, but for a grown, obviously. So he's not in that kind of position. He's not in some kind of hostile relationship with the camera. He's holding his stick, he's leaning on a stick, and then now you can see the difference between a walking stick and a Nob Theory, because in that case, he's got both. He's got something that looks like a walking stick, and he's got something that is a Nob Theory. And this is another example of a studio photograph of Zulu policemen. And this one was taken by Sir Benjamin Stone, who again is one of those sort of, his archive of ethnographic photographs is kind of legion. And you can see again here the presence of the studio and the way in which the studio becomes a kind of setting for taking these photographs. And again, the same themes, barefoot, Nob Theories, and then again you see the jewelry. The policeman who's standing there is wearing one of those kind of, they sort of call different names, but they like the tongue. I'll call it a tongue piece because it sort of hangs on your neck like a tongue. He's wearing jewelry. And then the other photograph, Sir Alfred Hugh, or Alfred Hugh Fisher, and another kind of almost typical image of Zulu policemen. But this is where the Nob Theory story becomes a little complicated, because as you can see, those two men are actually carrying two quite different Nob Theories. The one Nob Theory is nobbled, it's got little grooves on it, and the other one is just a smooth surface. Now, these policemen sort of represent the image that most South Africans are most familiar with of policemen, and that's the link between policemen and mining. So this is one of the things that, again, I'm sort of trying to destabilize, the fact that it wasn't just the mining industry that sort of invented the idea of a surveillance system in which Africans are sort of put through search and seizure procedures, stripping, etc., and that the person who's in charge of all of this, or the person who's regulating this, is the policeman. So the idea of the mine compound policeman is sort of fully represented because they're wearing those badges on their arms, and that's what you see in a lot of the photographs. There's a famous David Goldblatt photograph in which you just see the arm badge. So that's the image that I think people have of the kind of compound policeman. But that's the image that I'm trying to move away from. And one of the ways of moving away from that image is to actually read policing archives, which are so dead boring. But somebody's got to do the job. Military officers used to take themselves very seriously. They used to write very, very serious letters. So you have to get through the entire letter just to find out and there's a hierarchy. So every letter is like photocopied 20 times. So that like every person up the hierarchy or down the hierarchy gets a copy of every single. So it's like those emails, you know, where people press reply all. So this is the version of, like a colonial version of reply all, which you suddenly think, why am I getting this email? You should just send it to the person. So one of the interesting things about the geographic spread, because again, people often assume that because these policemen were Zulu, they were largely limited to the colony of Natal, but that's actually exactly the opposite. These policemen were often hired and taken to different parts of South Africa. So there are photographs of Zulu policemen from Kimberley in the Free State. There's these kinds of letters about policemen from the Transvaal. And one of the flashpoints of the presence of Zulu policemen in the Transvaal was the outbreak of war in 1899, what is now the South African War, what I still prefer to call the Anglo-Boer War. When that war broke out, there was a flurry of correspondence between state officials and military officials about how many policemen were in the Transvaal, or are in the Transvaal, and who they were. So one of the startling discoveries in part of this, as part of this military archive, is actually finding a list of all the policemen who were supposedly working in the Transvaal in the years 1899 to 1902. And again, what is surprising is that very few of them actually have Zulu names. They have names like Fat Boy, Vet Boy, one of my favorite one, Cash. And Cash became a very important character. So you read these names and you think, okay, well, what makes these men Zulu if they don't even have Zulu names? They have very sort of, just funny, as I say, it's like the stuff of novels. But what was interesting about the use of the policemen, especially in urban areas, was that one of the justifications for importing Zulu men into the emerging urban townships of South Africa was that they were imported exactly because they did not belong, they were not urbane, they were not from the urban area. And as the senior officer explains, he says, native constables, provided they be without local interests, are much more useful in policing people of their own color than European police could be. In addition to keeping the native population under proper control, they have means of obtaining information which are not afforded to European police. So this idea that somehow the Zulu policeman is without local interest, meaning that they are not on any side in the conflicts in the urban areas, was what made them attractive. And this was a kind of justification for increasing their numbers, obviously. And this person here is saying that European police, and I'll talk about European police in the next slide. So one of the peculiarities, again, of pre-Union South Africa was that policemen and magistrates often actually used to be given a higher pay if they spoke indigenous languages. And so this is a kind of one of these kind of things where he's showing that there's now a decline in that particular culture, because it was a particular period and a particular culture in which magistrates would speak the indigenous language of the people, basically whom they were administering justice to. So the history of white policemen is also a kind of in short supply in South Africa, but you get a lot of biographical and autobiographical writing, memoirs by officers. And this is one of those archives that, and again here, it's kind of ironic that even though I'm doing a project that's very antiquarian, the internet has come in handy. So I'm going to tell the story now a little bit about the internet. So Google's failed project of digitizing every book in the world has had the unfortunate consequence of actually digitizing the entirety of the colonial archive, because those are the only books that don't have copyright. So all the colonial records, like magistrates' reports, governor general's reports, are now on the internet. Legal cases, everything that you can fantasize about that has something to do with colonial ledgers and financial statements, everything you can ever imagine that was to do with the infrastructure of colonialism. Now Google has made it available to us, mahala, for free, gratis, on the internet, and you just have to do the right search. So as part of my search, I sort of been working through a lot, and now you can just download them. Before you used to have to go to the library and spend hours reading some person's memoir, which is not even that interesting. So now you can just download it, PDF it, convert into text, search it, and just say, I'm only going to read the parts that are relevant to my work. So this particular memoir is by H.P. Holt, and it sort of starts off with the words of Dartnell, who was involved in the establishment of the Natal police unit. So again here, pre-1910, every colony and every republic had to establish its own policing force. And that in itself is a story, again, that takes us back to the Loyal Fingal, because almost every single colony or every single republic copied what had been done in the Cape, including the uniforms. So all the uniforms used to start off with, let's start with corduroy. Oh, corduroy doesn't work. It's a bit hot in Natal. Let's find something else. So this is the story, basically, of the white policeman. And again here, contrary to what you may imagine if you read, now I've forgotten, ornamentalism, books like ornamentalism, which they're about kind of like the elite colonial officials. So the colonial officials who used to come, like Sir Harry Smith, wearing long patent leather over-the-knee boots, riding out in some sort of prime steed, some Arabian horse, riding out into the frontier, all properly dressed with medals, whatever. That's the image that people often have of colonialism, and there's the image that's often also entrenched by anti-colonial writers like Albert Memmi, in which the colonial is like a kind of shining, beautiful man who sort of, rides into the sunset to colonize the natives. But actually, the story is the opposite. So this is what Tatnell says. I wanted to send home for men, but this the government would not sanction. So I had to start recruiting amongst the flotsam and jetsam of the colony. And a very rough lot they proved to be, being principally old soldiers and sailors, transport riders, and social failures from home, etc. So again, he's giving you a completely different image of who the first policemen were. But as you soon find out, the clothing made all the difference. The clothing was at first the same as that worn by the frontier and armed mounted police, namely brown corduroy jacket and breeches, black leather boots coming nearly to the knee and buckled down the side, and a leather peaked cap with a white cover. It was a stinking uniform, however, which caused the men to be nicknamed the Snuffs. But anything in the shape of uniform was hard to get in the colony at the time. Afterwards, as more suitable uniform was obtained, the men began to put on a little side when walking out. And the then governor said to me one day, "Your men swagger too much." So that's one of the words that's going to be crucial to my project, swagger. "We don't want swashbucklers." To that I reply, if you knew the difficulty I have had to make them forget the name of Snuffs and instill a little swagger into them, you wouldn't wish to see it reduced. A little later, another governor said, with reference to his orderly at Government House, "I wish you wouldn't send a prince in disguise as my orderly, for he looks so spick and span that I'm almost ashamed of my own get-up whenever I pass him." So this is a kind of conversation with that history of ornamentalism, in the sense that in South Africa there was none of that ornamentalist kind of only the noble, only the high-class officers used to come to South Africa. In this case, it was exactly the opposite. The police force had to invent a kind of body image, basically, of a policeman. And in this case, you get exactly like a compact story of what that body image was about. It was about the right uniform, the right clothing, and then the right swag, the right swagger. And then part of the story is also a story about economy. So I'm also calling it this I'm using a lot of economics term, expenditure, and how it is that the state, again, contrary to what sometimes people believe, was actually trying not to spend money on policing. It wasn't flooding its resources into the police force. It was trying to do exactly the opposite. So there was also this idea of how do you get a spick and span uniform, how do you get swag for as little as possible. Now the other part of the story, and this is the part in which people like Makema Fuze contribute, is that the African elite was very litigious in the 19th century. And part of this litigation involved going to magistrates who were often protected or who had almost as their secretary a Zulu policeman. And the policeman often used to prevent people from having an audience with the magistrate. And so one of the commentators on this problem of the antagonism that existed between the African elite and the policemen is Saul Plaatje. And that's a little biography of Saul Plaatje. But in 1911, he wrote, and many of you may know this literature, on gangs in the mining towns of South Africa in the early part of the 20th century. So he contributes to both the literature on gangs, but also on the literature on policemen, because he gives us this description of what a Zulu policeman looked like in the early part of the 20th century. He says, "For a picture of the average Zulu policeman at Johannesburg, I would depict this: a creature giant-like and large as to proportions, ferocious and forbidding of aspect, most callously brutal of action, and irredeemably ignorant." The knowledge that it is but necessary to call attention to the higher police officials to this matter to obtain remedy, and that there is no more kindly, courteous, and humane gentleman anywhere than is Major Douglas, etc., etc. So in that description, so Blaikie is basically presenting what I'm calling this literature of antagonism between the African elite and the Zulu policemen. But what I didn't want the project to be about was simply to be an account of this antagonism, because after a while it would become very boring, because you just get exactly the same description over and over again. Oh, the Zulu policeman is ignorant, ferocious, etc., etc. And this is where also the jokes, because there are still even jokes today about Zulu, because now it's security guards, right? So the one joke that a friend of mine likes telling is about how it is that you should never, ever, ever tell a Zulu policeman that, or a Zulu security guard in this case, that he must not let anybody in. Because then when you come back and you say, he'll say, but you said I must not let anybody in, so you can't go in either. Like that kind of thing. So those kinds of jokes are still common even now. And I don't know if any of you know them, the Munching Elan joke, because that's the other name for Night Watchmen, is Munching Elan, right? And you, I don't know how many people know that joke, but the story basically goes that a Zulu policeman saw somebody walking a line and saying, I am marching a line, and they sort of thought, oh, this is what, and then it became, I am munching a line. Oh. So, but it's a complicated joke. Those who know, but it's too difficult to explain. I'll explain in the Q&A. Okay, so to get back then to our whole thing about clothing. So we have the, what would one call it? The supreme, the embodiment of the African policeman in the Loyal Fingal. Then we have this archive of photographs from the 19th century, mostly taken by professional photographers. And so there's that question of what that was, and what was it about, who was consuming these images. And then we have the history of white policemen and the way in which white policemen had to be made. They sort of just didn't come fully formed and imported from Britain. They had to be made in the colonies. And as I said earlier, one of the ways in which white policemen were made was that they themselves created this journal called Nongai. And again here, when you go to the archives, when you say to or people who even know about the military and you say, oh, the journal Nongai, people look at you strangely and go, what is that? You have to say Nonkwai, because that's what it was, that's the pronunciation that people use. And this journal existed, this magazine existed right up until the 1970s, when the name was changed to Server Mus. Now, when it was created in the early 20th century, it was basically the military equivalent of GQ magazine. It was men telling stories about masculinity, writing poetry. So there's like hundreds of poems written by white policemen. There's adverts for cigarettes, adverts for shaving cream, adverts for shoe polish. There's letters, there's photographs, very bizarre photographs of families where people would dress their children in miniature uniforms. There's all these photographs, and this is like a whole other thing, especially after the whole Cecil the Lion story. There's a whole, like a set of photographs of police units with their mascots. And it used to be like some animal, like a zebra or an ostrich or whatever. And this animal was sort of kept around the police station or around the whatever the headquarters of the police unit was. So there are all these photographs of them posing with all these different animals. As I say, it was mostly zebras, but it could be other animals. There's many photographs that depict, in a way, the white policeman in motion as active. But there's virtually, in this magazine, no photographs of African policemen, no letters of African policemen, from African policemen, except dismissive ones, where African policemen would write and complain about their treatment or some other issue pertinent to them, and they would get like a letter dismissing them, like this officer or this policeman must go and speak to his superiors, which was part of the problem, but that's how they would be dismissed. And so then in trying to think about how all of this comes together, I go back again to the fact that the archive itself tells a different story. Because if you read the rules, and these are the rules that were published in the Natal Police Force Revised Rules and Regulations, again, just click away on Google, in which it basically states that policemen were not meant to wear any accessories. It says native and Indian police must at all times be properly dressed in uniform, except when employed upon detective duty, and the wearing of beads or ornaments of any kind is prohibited. So again, it brings us back to the Roland Barthes observation. Why then are all these policemen basically photographed wearing ornaments and jewelry? What does it say about self-styling? All the terms that people are now using to talk about African fashion, self-styling, swagger, obviously, and all the other bodily metaphors that are often used specifically to talk about Zulu bodies. And we can talk about this again in the Q&A. There's a specific almost vocabulary that emerges to talk about Zulu policemen. And one of those vocabularies is the before and after. So in the Kimberley literature, and again here, completely counterintuitive, but the Chamber of Mines, for example, in their annual statements, used to put all these ethnographic photographs in there. So they would be like, this is how you process gold. And then, and this is a picture of a Zulu policeman, right in the middle of this supposed annual report of the Chamber of Mines. And so all that kind of vocabulary, and in that there used to be a lot of the before and after pictures, in which a photographer would basically take a picture of a Zulu military regiment and write before at the bottom, and then take a picture of a group of policemen like the photograph there, and then just write after. And so there's a lot of kind of before and after photographs in which there's like a line, a kind of genealogy, as it were, between the Zulu military system and then the kind of conversion of these bodies into the bodies of policemen. And obviously the two images had nothing to do with each other. They were not actually before and after photographs, but they are presented in that way. So there's that whole story about before and after. But ultimately, as I say, it's really about this whole question of what does clothing do when it is actualized, when it is functionalized in the way that Roland Barthes writes about it. Thank you.
Thank you.